Assalamu alaikum student. Welcome back to Research Methodology course, lecture number 3, and today we are going to talk a little more about literature review, which we already had in the previous lecture. Before we actually go into the details of today's lecture, let's have a look at what we did last week. Last session what we talked about was what was the broad problem area, that is the entire situation where one sees a need for problem solving. Then we looked at that we conduct literature review to understand the problem in a little more detail and get more information about that problem area. For collecting information, we said there are different sources from which we can get information, such as books, reports, published papers. And the reason we tend to do literature review and collecting more information is so that we are aware of that problem, we get more aware of it, we understand what are the issues. So once we read more about it, we are able to understand that problem in a better manner. We also are able to identify the key variables which are playing an important role in that particular for that particular issue, and based on identifying all these variables, we are also able to develop some kind of theory, a robust theory which is based on previous literature, previous researches. So whatever theory we develop is basically stemming out of the previous researches. So far out, basically generally what we tend to do is we try to, the problem we identified earlier in our organization, for that, to understand more about that problem, we looked at the different literature. Literature provided us some information which enriched our understanding of the problem. And based on those understandings, we were able to identify variables which influences the problem, the issue, and driving from that information, we develop our own theory. So once we are able to develop our literature review, we are able to, as I said, we are able to develop our theory, or what we call as a theoretical framework. So all these two steps we talked about are interrelated, and today we, as I said earlier, that we're going to go back and try to have again a much deeper look into the literature review. We will talk about why literature review is important. We'll talk about how to write, what are the different methods of writing literature review, and what are the contents of a literature review. So previously we just generally talked about literature review. Now we're going to go a little more detail and talk about how the different methods, the way we write literature review, and how are the contents of the literature review written. Driving from that, we will move on and develop our theoretical framework, in which we will try to identify the relationship and the theory supporting the relationship. So two things we're going to talk about. Whatever theoretical framework we have developed, in that we will be basically identifying different variables and the relationship between these variables, the link between these variables, and then the second component of a theoretical framework is we need to also develop a theory explaining, supporting the relationship we already had identified. While we're defining the theoretical framework, we were, as I said earlier, that we're going to use variables. So we're going to talk about a little more detail into what are the different types of variables, and how are they influenced, how they are linked between the different, how the different variables linked with each other. Okay, so I previously talked about a little bit about the literature review. We said that literature review will help us avoid unnecessary duplication. So once we look out and try to see whatever existing literature exists, It will help us to find out that if some already research has been conducted in that area, meaning that if there is already some research conducted for a particular problem, then there is no point in conducting a research again, because that would be a duplication of it. So while conducting a literature review, we're able to identify and see if there is already research conducted, thorough research conducted in that area. Then there is no need to go and further redo that research. All we can do is, based on that research, the existing research, we can make our own decisions in the light of the previous work, rather than conducting our new research. Because if that area has been sufficiently proven, identified and studied, all you need to do is take the findings from those research and apply them in your work conditions. So instead of doing it again, it's better to look into the literature and find out if other people have done similar research. If they have, and it serves the purpose and serves your purpose, and is very relevant to your problem area, then you don't need to conduct research. So existing literature, studying of existing literature information will help you avoid duplication of research. Another reason we tend to do and we tend to conduct this literature review is that we want to identify all the different types of variables which are influencing our problem. Because, as I said earlier, that while conducting interviews with your managers, your employees concerning the broad problem area, you might be able to identify some of the variables which might influence. But again, there might be some other variables which might be skipped or not covered by the interview sessions, or not identified by you or your other managers. So while you look at the literature, you study the literature, you are able to find out what other people have been able to do and what other people are doing in terms of that problem, what are the variables they have studied, and which variables were the very important variables, which were not very important. So it basically expands your knowledge for that area and helps you identify the variables concerning the problem. Another advantage of conducting literature review is that you're able to identify the different procedures adopted by different researchers. That is, what are the different tests or statistical tools or techniques used, how the data was collected, what were the different methods for collecting data, how was data screened, how the data was filtered, what are the different procedures they have used, meaning the previous researchers have used to research, and these tools could then be used by you if they are applicable for your research. So basically, existing literature will help you know what kind of techniques were used, what kind of procedures were used previously, and either you could use similar techniques for your research, some proven techniques which have been successful, and or you could use some different techniques in case the previous techniques are not good enough, or you feel they were not adequate enough. So by studying previous literature, you will be able to identify the procedures used by previous researchers and design in your research. You can design your own procedures. You can use your own procedures which are more suited to you, or use the existing procedures which have been used by previous authors, previous researchers. Another advantage of conducting a literature review is that you can also limit your study. By studying the existing literature, you will be able to identify the domains, the areas which are relevant to you and the areas which are not. So by studying the existing literature, you'll be able to differentiate the issue where the problem lies, and if that area is within your scope. And by studying this literature, you will find out that some of the literature which identifies that a particular problem is either falls under the organizational issue, or is it under the economic economic section, or is it it deals with the financial area of your organization, it deals with the behavioral area. So by studying existing literature, you will be identify that what is the domain of your research, and this will help you design and run your research more efficiently. There were two steps in conducting literature review. One is generally termed as the survey of literature. The other is termed as the documentation of the literature. In the survey, basically, in this particular step, you search, you look, you read literature which is available. And in the documenting of the literature component or the step, what you tend to do is you write what you have read in your own words, that whatever the previous researchers have done or written, and you try to synthesize, summarize their work and present it in a way that someone who is not researching but reading your research can get familiarized with the different existing literature which has been published in that area, people who have written in that area. So what you tend to do is read what people have done, search and read them, and then synthesize and summarize the work which you have read in a way that people who are reading your research can get a good view of whatever literature has been written previously, whatever literature which has been written previously. So it provides the reader of your research an overall picture of what has been written concerning the broad problem area which we already identified. While conducting the survey, as we said, that is where we are trying to search for information, search for literature. There are different sources which are like books, research articles, theses, conference proceedings. Among some of these, you will find out that some books would be useful to get to know or understand the issue. For understanding the general issue, there could be some specific books which can help you define the issue. You can look into the research articles and identify what kind of different variables these research have been focused on which affect the problem area. You can look at the different theses which have been conducted to address that problem area. Similarly, there are different conference proceedings. You can read and read the proceedings and find out what the previous researchers have done, or what the previous literature have been written. Or to obtain all these kinds of information, you could use libraries, you could use the internet, and as I said earlier, that you could use online databases. And there are certain databases which are full text, which you can find the full article in which you of your interest. Or there could be there could be databases which just keep a track of the abstracts, and once you read through all the abstracts, you can identify the research article which is of your interest, and then try to request and acquire the full article if that article seems to be very relevant to your research. So you basically survey and try to search for information relevant to the problem area which you have identified, and try to raise the level of understanding of that problem and problem area. Once you're able to read and sufficiently spend some time collecting information for your area, problem area, then you sit down and try to document it as well. And while documenting, there are 3 activities which need to be considered. One of the activity while documenting is that what you tend to do is you follow a certain method of developing what we call as a list of reviewed articles. This activity involves of developing a detailed list of the article which you have reviewed. What you tend to do is you document it. You keep a record of what article which you have reviewed, what was the author for that article, when was that article published, what year this article was published. So the details of the article, such as the year of publication, the journal which has been published, the title of the article, what you tend to do is you keep a list of all those articles, books which you have surveyed, and you develop a list for that. This particular step is what we call as the method of documenting a list of the reviewed articles, or the more. And there are different modes for documenting that. We're going to talk about these different modes a little later during this session. The second activity you tend to do while documenting the literature is that you try to reference, you try to cite and quote the articles which you have read. Whatever the articles you have read, what the authors have written in those articles, when you quote that, when you cite that, that's like that part of the documentation of review. The first, as I said, was basically developing a list of the articles which you have surveyed and which were relevant to you. You keep a list of that. And then the second activity you tend to do is while writing the review, you try to reference, cite, or quote previous authors' work, what they have done, what did they say, what were their findings. That kind of thing, when you start documenting it and referencing it, is the second type of activity you tend to do. And one thing which, while writing, while documenting, while referencing, is that how you arrange and how you basically organize this document, the literature review in journal, what we are talking about. The arrangement is also, we need to look at that there is a method to that as well. And while you're writing the review, you basically need to make sure that it follows a structure. It follows a kind of organized, it's in an organized way, so that the reader can better understand the situation. So there are 3 activities while doing a documenting of literature. First is the method of documenting the list of reviewed articles. That is how to document the list. The second is how to quote and cite previous authors, and generally how would be the structure of that review, how the structure, how what will be the flow of that review which you are writing. What is going to be the flow? I mean, it has to start from somewhere, it has to end somewhere. So you need to look at that you need to follow a certain structure while writing the review. So the review has also some kind of a structure which needs to be followed. Before we look at the structure, how we structure our review, let's look at how we develop a list. What I wanted to say here is that while developing a reference list, or there's another terminology which is called the bibliographic list, is a list of work that is relevant to the main topic, arranged in an alphabetical order. The list of articles which are concerned to your study are arranged in a manner, which in an alphabetical manner, and basically usually they tend to be at the end of your report or research article. So at the end of the research article, what you tend to do is you append a reference list or a bibliographic list, which all has the author's name, the year of publication, the article name, the journal it was published, that details. All these authors are placed at the end of the research, and they are sorted in an alphabetic manner. The difference between a bibliography and a reference list is that the authors which have been quoted within your literature review, the ones which have been discussed within your research, are placed in the reference list. And the authors which have been not discussed in your research, but you think they are important and relevant, but you did not quote them, or you did not use them, you did not cite them, they could be placed in your bibliographic list. In other words, your bibliographic list has both, could have people, the authors who have been cited in your research and who have not been cited. So bibliographic is a more larger list, whereas reference list is a subset of the bibliography, whereby the reference list only lists those articles, those researchers whose work has been cited in your research article or in your literature review. Anywhere in the research, if you have cited some authors, then you can place those authors in your reference list, whereas the bibliographic list can have both kind of authors, people whose work has been cited or not cited but are relevant. So a bibliography could be the readings which you have done but not used in your research article for referencing or citing, but you feel that they are important, so you provide them and you place them in your bibliographic list. But the people whose work has been cited, who's been referenced, are placed in your reference list. Let's look at some of the modes or the methods of referencing and developing a reference list. There are different modes of referencing in business research. For example, the APA publication of Manual of American Psychology Association, well, most commonly known as the APA mode, the Chicago manual style, the Howard style, the Turabian style. All these are different styles. Basically, these styles they have developed different manuals which specifies with examples how to put the name of the book, the authors, the newspaper, the year of publication, the format. In the format, what should be the format of placing and these names, books, the article names, the authors' names in the reference list. And you can follow any one of them, but the book particularly we are using follows the APA style of referencing. I have I attached a few examples from the book. Let's have a look at some of these examples. Okay, let's look at the specimen format for citing different types of references. If a book is by a single author, the way you do is you write the last name, the middle, the first name, the abbreviation of the first name, the year of publication, and the title of the book, which is Management on the World Wide Web, published at Prentice Hall, by Prentice Hall. These are the publishers. This is the city or the state where this particular book has been published. So basically starting with the last name, the middle, and the first name. The middle name has just the abbreviation has been used with a dot. So this is one way of referencing your authors, different authors which have been quoted or cited in your research. Another example is if the book is by more than more than one author, you basically start writing the first author's name, and then you place a dot and a semicolon, here, then separating the second author, and the third author you're using the word and, or the symbol and, indicating the third author, and then follows the year of publication, the title of the article, which city it was published, and which was the publishing house which published this particular article. So by looking at all of these, there are different variations you will be able to find in terms of the referencing which has been done while in the reference list, the modes which have been followed. There are different modes which can be followed, and this particular one is an APA format. And if you look at the APA manual, you will be able to find many more examples like that. Let's have a look at a few more, the ones I've placed in the greens. The journal articles, how they are done it, again, you have the last name of the author, the first, and if there are two authors, this is the second author, and the year of publication, the article of been published, the title of the article, but there is a dot in between, and see how they have been separated, the first author's name with a dot and a comma, moving on with an and symbol indicating the second author, if there are two authors for that. So this is how the APA suggests the mode of writing for research articles, and the way you make your reference list is this is the way you need to do it. If it's another example is if it's a doctoral dissertation or a thesis, this is how you do it. Basically, again, name of the author, the year of the publication, the title of the author, and if it's unpublished doctoral dissertation, you state that it's an unpublished doctoral dissertation and at which university it was conducted, that particular. So this is an example of how to basically write in your reference list the doctoral thesis, how to write the list. This is the mode how you do that. Another one is if it's a newspaper and there is no authors for that, basically the new GM Pact, the year of publication, and this is basically the newspaper in which this was published and which page it was published. So you could find a lot of examples within these manuals which will help you guide that how are you going to develop your reference list, and by following this list you can develop your bibliography or your reference list, allowing to record or document the different authors which have been studied by you, surveyed by you, which have been either referenced or cited by you or not. But this is how you do it. And then if you go back to the book, you'll be able to find many more examples. And if you want to look at the full manual, the manuals are available on the net, which you can access them and then use them for developing your own reference list. So once you are able to develop your reference lists, which is usually the end of your research report, and as I said, there are different modes for writing your reference lists. One tends to follow one of the modes, anyone which is preferred by your research journal, or which has been preferred by your research research community. So you can follow that particular mode of developing your list. But generally this particular book follows the APA format, and you can have a look at it on the net. You can find the APA manual for referencing, and that can help you develop your own reference list. So the first step was, as I said, one of the activities, not the first step, but one of the activities was to develop a reference list of your articles which you have you have studied, you have reviewed. And the second, one of the other activities was how to reference or how to quote the studies within your research. That is now how to cite. So that's when you cite the references in the body of the paper using author year method of citation. That is the surname of the author and the year of publication, like Kaleem 2004 has shown that these two variables influence the dependent variable, or another research could be that in the recent studies of employee motivation, Freeman in 2007, Mittensberg in 2007 state that it has so forth. So the way you quote the work is that you basically use the author and the year method of citation, and this way basically you can by referencing the authors and then following that following their name and the year, what you can discuss is whatever they have written or whatever they have quoted, and this is the method you tend to follow all throughout your literature review. Another example is in 1997, Kyle compared the different models of motivation. Now again, you're looking at the surname and the year being referenced, but according to the sentence, you have rearranged and the surname and the author to make the sentence look more meaningful and the flow of the sentence more meaningful. So one way of referencing them is within your text or literature review is this, which is the author year method. There are other methods which we can look at, but at a later stage we'll try to come back to that issue. At this point, let's look at some more examples of that. Here again in this line number 2, when work of author, when the work of his author is by two individuals, always cite both names every time the reference occurs in the text. Now there is again another guideline provided by the APA that if there are two authors, this is how you do it, and so forth. So there are a number of ways, and there are different examples. By examples, the authors have shown that what could be the different ways of referencing the authors within the text of your research article. So wherever when you're citing certain authors, how do you cite them? You basically identify the author's surname and the year, and then following that, what you can do is you can write what they have been able to find in their researches. On the other hand, there could be different scenarios. There could be two authors who have written that article. There is a method of that. There could be more than two authors. Then there is another method in which you basically try to use the et al. Instead of writing all of the author's name. What you tend to do is you tend to say et al. Indicating the first author, and then instead of quoting all different authors' name, maybe 6 or 7 different authors who have jointly written the article or the book, instead of writing all of their names, you tend to just use the first author's name, and then you can just write et al., indicating that there are more than 5 or 6 different authors to this article, and instead of writing all of their names, this is how APA suggests that you should quote. This is how you should reference your research. So you can have a look at the different ways, and a detailed one, as I said earlier, that the manual APA manual is available on the net, where you can study the different ways of quoting. And if you're in doubt, always go back to that and have a look at it, that how should you in your work quote, reference your literature, in your literature, the different authors and their work. So have a look at that, and with the passage of time you will be able to become more used to the method and the technique how to reference. Some more examples which are following. You can look at this particular example, which says, when the same author has several works published in the same year, cite them in the same order as they occur. Okay, they're different guidelines. This is again another guideline which suggests that if there are, if an author has published multiple articles, and for the same topic, this is how you treat them. This is how you reference them, and how to quote them. There are again different examples. So you have a look at that, and develop your skills in how to quote different authors, how to reference different authors. So please have a look at some of the examples which are at the end of the chapter 3, and see how APA suggests that how these referencing should be made. While you're doing all this referencing, the background, you need to make sure that your article is written, or you most importantly, the literature review which you have written is written in a structured way. What I mean by that is, once you start writing your review or documenting the previous work, it should not just be written in a chronological way, not by the sequence of dates, but it should be written in a way that makes sense to people. It makes some logical sense to the reader. So it should be written in a structured way, and one good way of writing is that while writing the review, you need to arrange them. You can arrange the segment of your review. The first segment, where you should, in the introduction section, basically what you should talk about is the importance of the subject. So while you're writing your review, you should talk about why this particular research article is, why this particular research problem is important, what is the significance of this research, what kind of role it plays in the management. So before the actual nitty-gritty or details of the research or the variables are discussed, you want to talk about the importance of that issue. So it brings it gets the attention of the reader, that how important this article is, how big that issue is. So once you are able to get their attention by identifying the importance of it, you can also you should state the purpose of this and the scope of the review. That in this particular research, what is the purpose? Why are you reviewing this? What is the purpose of this research, and what is the scope? What is going to be considered while in the review? So these two things you need to talk about in the beginning. Once you are able to give the importance and define the purpose of your research in the first few lines, then you can go in detail and talk about defining the different concepts which are concerning the problem area or the problem. So what you need to do is you can then define what are the different key variables, and what kind of what by that mean is you can look at the definition of different variables and define them right in the very beginning, so that once the reader reads, he is able to, or she is able to understand these concepts right in the very beginning, because there could be different terminologies you're using, like the article we're looking and we studied in the last session on flexi time. Before right away going and talking about the importance of flexi time and to the performance of an individual or to the absenteeism, first thing you need to do is talk about what flexi time is all about, so the author can understand the concept, that is able to appreciate the concept, and then the reader should be able to further on read about the issues which influence or which are linked with that particular concept. So defining the concept earlier on helps the reader to get more used to the terms, so there is nothing which is unexplained, so he's got much clarity into what sort of variables he's going to come across and what is the definition for that. So what basically you need to do is you need to look at the different definitions which are found in the literature, and then which definition you are following for in this particular article is to be used in particular articles to be followed in this research, can be defined in the very first few pages, so that the reader is able to appreciate and understand what the issue is all about. Following that, what you can do is you can do a critical review of the different researches concerning that problem area, what these researchers have been able to find out, what kind of relationship they've been able to establish. So basically, in this, once defining the different concepts which are concerning your research, you can look at and talk about different relationships you've been able to identify in your previous studies. What are the different variables which the previous studies have been able to study and work with, and what are the relationships there. So make sure that here you don't list one study after the other, but what you try to do is you try to classify or compare and contrast between the different problems different researchers have been able to do concerning the problem area which you have identified, and then move on from that point onwards. So you need to basically you need to review the previous researchers and what these previous researchers have been able to identify, what variables they've been able to work with, what kind of relationships they've been able to establish, and basically what you can do is you can contrast and compare different studies concerning the same issue, and write your review based on what X author has written and what sort of variables he has considered, what were the findings as compared to what the author Y has written, and what are the variables he considered and what were the findings. So comparing between them, you might be able to again further on find out or identify that maybe both of these authors might have missed an important area which was not covered by neither of them, and that's where you start identifying the gap as to which areas which were not covered by previous researchers, and that's a cue to what you are going to do or what you should be doing in terms of conducting your research. So while writing the critical review of the previous researchers, in this particular segment, you can organize your review according to different themes and then summarize them, the different reviews into where you basically try to identify the gaps which previous researchers were not able to cover, and that's where it leads to the identification of your research problem, the clear identification of research problem. Let's have a look at an example here. quickly, where what they have done, the authors have basically condensed a literature review, identifying the as I said, they're basically trying to reference at the same time and arrange this review in a structured manner. So let's look at the first few lines. Let's go together. It says, organization theorists have defined organizational effectiveness, that is OE, in various ways. OE has been described in terms of objectives by these authors, and here you see there are two authors to there, and the year of publication. Goals, that's another way of defining organizational effectiveness by this author in 1960. Efficiency by another author in 1966, and the resource acquisition by these authors. So here basically is trying to identify that what are the different definitions which have been or the different concepts which have been considered for the term organizational effectiveness by the different authors. So here generally, if you look at, he has identified some of them consider organization effectiveness is that it is the efficiency. Someone said it is goals. The third said it's the resource acquisition, and so forth. So here he is basically to identify what are the different definitions different authors have used to define OEE. And then he further said that there is remarkable, there's little consensus. So here he says remarkably that there is little consensus as to how to conceptualize and measure or explain OEE. So based on the different definitions being followed by different authors, here the author is trying to look at that organizational effectiveness has a problem. This term has a problem because it has been identified by different authors as either its goals, its efficiency, its resource acquisition, and here he is trying to illuminate that there is no consensus, there is no common definition for this particular term, for that to be measured, how to measure. There is no common consensus as to how to measure organization. Someone says you need to look at the goals. Someone says you need to, if you want to measure organization effectiveness, you need to look at the efficiency. Someone said it is you need to look at the resource acquisition in order to measure organization effectiveness. So based on whatever previous researchers have made, this author is trying to bring our attention to the point that there is no consensus on what the measure should be. So this should be how, so this is the gap he's trying to identify. So this should, however, not come to surprise to us, that since OE models are essentially value-based, and he then discusses the different themes, why these there is a problem with this particular problem, and why there are different definitions. So, however, he said that there are still limiting them. There are some limitations, and what we need to do is we need to look at. He's saying that we, instead of taking the broader or more dynamic approach, is to be needed. Instead of focusing, he's saying that instead of focusing at just one view or the second view or the third view, he said we need to come and develop a more dynamic definition for OE and so forth. So in this particular article, this review, he's basically, again, as I said, defining the different terms, the difference between the different terms, identifying the gap, and then drawing based on that. He's trying to come down to the point where he's trying to identify that what is the research problem which this author intends to address. But before that, he's trying to establish that he has read all the previous researchers which are concerned with organizational effectiveness. He has identified that there's a problem there, that there are different definitions to that, and he's also saying that we can develop a more dynamic definition for that. So all of that is in a more logical manner. He's trying to write his review accordingly, so that the reader is able to appreciate the work, the survey, the previous studies which the author has done, and based on that, the author, the researchers will then again be able to develop their own research problems. So one, as I said, this is one of the examples, but another example was, if you want to look at, is the article we looked at previously on the attendance issue, on the flexi time issue. Please have a look at it and see and study the first 2 pages at least to appreciate how the literature review has been written, and you will find all of that, how its referencing is being done, how the structure of that article has been followed. You will find and try to see that how and where the author has identified the importance of the issue, the scope or the objective of the research, define the different key variables, moving on what existing literature review or existing research articles have published in that area, what kind of relationship they have been looked at, and then within that the existing literature, while writing his review, the authors tend to bring out the gaps, and based on those gaps then they are able to clearly define their research questions or research problems. So but before we go that, let's look at the questions which could be formulated for this particular paragraph which you looked at. Is based on the reviewer. The research question which could be formulated was, what could be the dimensions? One of the research question could be, what are the dimensions, what could be the dimensions used for measuring OE? So this is one of the research questions after the end of the research review, after the review of the articles. The authors can safely develop their own research questions as to what is the best way, or what are the right dimensions, what are the right dimensions which could be used for measuring OU, because he has established previously that there are problems with defining the concept of OE, and previous researchers are not following one particular mode of measuring organization efficiency, effectiveness. So this is what we need to do. We need to look at that one of the research problem which the researcher is addressing could be this one. The other could be, what are the factors which affect OEE? That's another thing he had in his review hinted that by studying the different factors which affect OEE, we were able to understand the issue much better. So this is just another research question which could be formulated out of the review of the literature review which we just saw earlier. So once the research questions have been stated, then one is ready to develop a theoretical framework of their research. And while developing your theoretical framework, you basically theorize on the basis of your beliefs. Whatever you've read, whatever you've come across, it helps you develop your belief. Whatever you observed, it helps you develop your beliefs. So based on whatever you've studied, the information you achieved, what you observed, you develop your own beliefs, and based on your belief you develop a theory. And so a theoretical framework is basically a representation of your beliefs and on how certain phenomena or variables are or concepts are related, and an explanation of why you believe that these associations these are associated with each other. So there are two components to while defining the theoretical framework is, and the one is focused on how are these different variables related. And the second component of theoretical framework is you try to justify logically and explain why these variables are related. Because so far what you've done is you've written your review, and at this point of view, you are able to develop your own theory about the issue. And once you're able to develop your own theory at this stage, what basically you want to identify that these are the different variables which are linked with each other, and why are they linked with each other. So how are they linked with each other and why are they linked with each other is basically what we call as a theoretical framework. The component where we're trying to look at how they are linked with each other is basically where we're trying to define the model, and the component where we're trying to say why they are linked together, this is where we're trying to define the theory. So you need to look at both. You need to develop the model, you identify the different variables and the relationship of these variables with each other, and the second component of theoretical framework is you need to theorize and you need to explain why these relationships are the way you think they are. You need to come up with and logically explain why they are, and that now at this stage is this is your understanding, your belief of what the relationship is. Previously, in the literature review, you were talking about what other authors thought about this relationships, what other author thought about the relationship between these variables was. But at this stage, when you're developing a theoretical framework, it is now your belief, and this is your model as to what are the different variables which are linked with each other and why are they linked with each other. So this is what basically needs to be done in the theoretical framework. Going back again, we said that there are two components to theoretical framework. First, you need to identify the variables and their relationship. The second is we try to describe the relationship with our arguments that why there is a relationship exists. So while identifying the different variables, we need to differentiate between the two kinds of variables. Mostly the different kind of variables which we're dealing with. Generally, when we say that there are two kinds of variables, generally you will find out that there is your independent variable and there is your dependent variable. But before we talk about what is an independent variable or what is a dependent variable, let's look at what is a variable. We say that variable is anything that can take on different or varying values as a variable. A variable can have, a variable is something which can have different values. Values can be different at different times for the same object or person, or at the same time for different objects or persons. E.g., let's say we're looking at the production unit, the production units produced by an employee 1. On Monday, let's say he has produced 10 units. On Tuesday, he has produced 11 units. The same employee, his production on Monday is different, on Tuesday is different. So the production is a variable, and production of employee 1 is one variable, and it's different on Monday, it's different on Tuesday, because production unit by employee 2 could be different. It could be 12 units on Monday, and it could be 10 units on Tuesday. So production by employees is again a variable because it can have different values at different times. Or another example is attendance. We can say that attendance of the department at the department on Monday was 10. The attendance on Tuesday was 2. Again, keeping the same variable, we are trying to see attendance as a variable, and here the variable attendance is having receiving two different values. So any object or a person which can have different values is a variable. So once we are clear on the term of what is a variable, we want also to talk about a little bit on the types of variables which are used in your research. The general category is the independent variable, dependent, moderating, and mediating variable. These are the 4 types of variables. We are going to just briefly introduce these variables in this session, but as we go to the next session, then we'll go have a more detail into that. But now let's just have a look at the first 2 variables in a little more detail. Let's look at the dependent variable. The dependent variable is also termed as a criterion variable. This variable is of our prime interest because it tries, here we try to describe or explain the variability or predict it, predict the dependent variable. What basically we try to do is try to explain the dependent variable. We try to predict the dependent variable, and we try to describe the dependent variable. Here we also try to look at we try to study what are the variables which influence the dependent variable. And so by studying these, we might be able to find solution. The reason we want to study the dependent variable is because that's the key variable of concerning the problem area, and by studying this variable, we are be able to solve our problem within the organization. So if we understand the variable in more detail, we are able to solve and come up with solutions which can take care of that problem. So a dependent variable basically is studied so that we are able to understand the problem better, and once we study that variable in more detail, then we are able to in a scientific manner explain, describe, or basically define the problem in a more scientific manner. So a dependent variable basically will help us help us by studying the dependent variable. We'll be able to explain and understand the problem while studying the dependent variable. An example could be that the problem concerning the problem, one of the problem could be that sales are low. Now sales is the dependent variable in that scenario, because we want to study why the sales are low. Similarly, if employee loyalty is dropping, the dependent variable for our study would be employee loyalty. So the problem and the dependent variable are very much closely linked, because as I said, if your organization is having a problem of low sales, then the dependent variable which you want to study is sales. And by studying the factors which influence sales, you might be able to solve your problem in a better manner, because if you are able to look at what are the different factors which influence the dependent variable, then we are able to explore and explain the problem, and then find solutions accordingly. As I said, let's say if there is a problem of sales, and you are able to basically go in detail and try to identify what are the different factors which influence sales. By studying the factors which influence sales, we can basically tune our solution accordingly based on the different factors which might influence it. So similarly, if employee loyalty is going down, we can study what are the factors which influence employee loyalty. So by controlling the factors, we will be able to improve the loyalty. Here again, what we need to really appreciate is that employee loyalty is something which is dependent on something. It is affected by some other things, and it is generated in a result of something else. Sales, again, if you look at it, sales again is generated by a result of different activities which an organization does first, and then sales happens. So there is there is what we need to understand as the dependent variable is affected by different factors, and what basically you want to look is what are the things which cause the variability in that dependent variable, what are the things which cause or through what kind of different factors. By studying different factors we can predict the dependent variable. To go and study more of these, we'll have to look at the what is an independent variable. Independent variable is the predictor variable, as I said, that which influences the dependent variable. The influence might be positive or negative. When independent variable is present, the dependent variable is also present. So there is, when we say what is the relationship between the two variables, we are saying that whenever the independent variable is brought out, the dependent will exist. Let's say whenever we try to increase the advertisement, sales will increase. So sales is dependent on advertising, sales is dependent on production, sales is dependent on quality. There could be different factors which might influence the dependent variable sales. So an independent variable when independent variable exists, you will see the dependent variable also exists. So when independent is present, the dependent variable also is present. With each unit of increase in the variable, in the independent variable, there is an increase or decrease in the. This is what we're again augmenting what we have said earlier, that wherever there is an independent variable, the dependent variable be all should be found, and if there is an increase in independent variable, there will be some effect on the dependent variable as well. It could be it could have a positive effect or a negative effect, but nevertheless there will be some effect on the dependent variable as well. In the case of loyalty, wherever when you are able to recognize your employees properly, you take care of your employees properly, you will generate loyalty within the employees. So loyalty is dependent on recognition, on the policies of the organization, which and so forth. Similarly, sales is dependent on production, on advertising, on quality, and so forth. So while looking at the scenario, you will see that in your study, again, the problem area, which was, let's say the problem was sales, the sales would decline in the organization. The variable under study is sales, and the problem was low sales. So we need to look at different factors such as I said, advertising, production, quality could be the different factors which might influence sales. Here, independent variables influences the dependent variable, and if there is shift in or there is a change in the independent variable value, there will be a corresponding change in the dependent variables. So by studying this kind of relationship, what the researcher intend to do is basically to establish that we might not be able to change the sales. What we want to is change sales. We want to have better sales, but how we're going to achieve better sales is by maneuvering the independent variables such as advertising, such as production, such as quality. And since sales is dependent, we just directly can't change that. It is a resultant of the different activities which need to be done before that, such as advertising. The more advertising we tend to do, it tends to create better sales results. The more better production we are able to do, or timely production we are able to do, the more sales we are able to do it. So sales basically is dependent on the variables such as advertising, production, or quality. So this is the kind of relationship we try to establish, and based on that, if once we are able to establish that out of these different independent variables, we might be able to establish that some of these variables have a much stronger influence as compared to the other variables. Then the management basically tends to focus on those areas more and develop policies accordingly, make management decisions and changes so that sales could be improved. So basically, a problem as initially what we started off was of sales, and the low sales can be improved by studying what are the factors which influences sales, and what the factors which influence sales are ABC, or advertising, quality, or production. By betterly improving the quality, by improving the advertising, we are able to improve the sales. So this is the basic logic behind developing again the theoretical framework and developing the kind of relationship between independent variable. With this, let's have a brief look at the other two kind of variables, that is the moderating variable and the mediating variable. We're going to go in more detail in the next few sessions, but moderating variable basically surfaces in between the independent and dependent variable at a given time. It is a variable which temporarily comes in between the independent variable. On the other hand, a mediating variable affects the relationship between the independent variable. To study these variables, that is the moderating and mediating variables, in more detail, the next session we will have some examples on it and try to define them in a more precise manner. Let's have a small quick look at this example and exercise. A manager believes that good supervision and training could increase the production level of workers. Here, if you look at this problem or this problem, that here the manager believes that good supervision and training would increase the production level here. So by just looking at these 3-4 lines, what we can establish that here, if we look at what would be the independent variables, the dependent variable here is basically the production level, because this is of the main concern of the management. The concern is that the management would like to increase. So this is a problem with the management. They are not happy with the production level, so they would like to increase the production. So in this case, the production level is the dependent variable, which needs to be studied, and by doing the literature review and so forth, and by observing, the authors have been able to identify, or the manager have been able to identify, that good supervision and training can improve the production level. So what they're trying to say is that by having good supervision and good training, which is both are independent, the dependent variable, which is the production level, can be improved. So this is one very small example of how basically your theoretical framework is developed from the theories which you have already observed or read or studied, and out of that the core, or the core within the theoretical framework, there are core concepts are of identifying different variables and the relationship with different variables, and the second component to that is developing the theory which is supporting. So after developing this model, you need to also look at define why the good supervision is linked with production level, and why training is linked with. You need to logically convince and theorize as how that by increasing good supervision, by having better supervision in the plant, usually they are able to guide, help, monitor your production employees, and which results into better production level. Similarly, better trained managers, better trained employees are able to handle machines better, handle different situations better. By giving them training, this will improve the production level of them. So both of these things are considered as developing the theoretical framework. The first one, when I said this is the model, and then the later part which I was talking about is how you theorize that why these relationships are the way you think they are. So let's have a recap as to what we did today. We said that we talked about literature review, which involves searching and documenting. The second thing we talked about again today was there are different formats of documenting, and we looked at some of the examples of the APA format. We also talked about that there is a structure of how to write the review, in which we try to identify the importance, following by objectives, definitions, relationship identified, and the gaps. This is a good format to follow while writing your literature review. Once you're able to do that, and based on the gaps, you are able to write your research questions. The next step you tend to do is you try to develop your theoretical framework, which represents your belief in how the variables are related and why are they related. And we also looked at generally the 4 different types of variables: the independent, dependent, moderating, and mediating variable. With this, we conclude our session, and then we will come back and talk about these variables in a little more detail in the next session. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.